chairpersons for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for coming so early for this session. So the topic of this session is keratoprosthesis, and my esteemed colleagues will be talking more about the intricacies of that procedure in later talks. What I thought I'd do to kick off this session is take us back a step to when we're facing the patient who has had one or two failed transplants and is looking at either another high-risk transplant or consideration for keratoprosthesis, and go through kind of a thought process as to what makes us sway one way or the other. I'll start by saying I have no financial interest in any of the techniques or products discussed today. And so just in basic, we all know that penetrating keratoplasty has been done successfully for a long time. Through advancements in techniques and instruments, it really has become the standard of care for replacing the diseased cornea. Now, in recent times, selective endothelial keratoplasty has obviously become much more the gold standard, but in general, for diseased cornea, penetrating keratoplasty is a very good procedure with very good success rates. But we know that there are risk factors for immunologic rejection as well as failure. Those listed here, specifically corneal stromal vascularization, prior graft failure. These are things that when we look at the patients preoperatively, we know that they have a higher chance of rejection. And what do we mean by high risk? People talk about the term high risk. When we go back to the collaborative corneal transplantation studies, they define high risk as 2 or more quadrants of stromal vascularization. But in the literature, it is defined in many ways. Some use the CCTS criteria, but most studies use a combination of that along with prior graft failures as defining a patient as being a high risk. So why do we bother stratifying these patients? Well, for low-risk patients where we do penetrating keratoplasty for a patient with keratoconus who has high drops and scarring, these patients have definitely a different survival rate than the high-risk corneas. For the low-risk patients, rejection rates in the literature range from 5 to 15% at a year, and corneal graft survival is very, very good, upwards of 90% at 5 years. Contrast that to patients who have the high-risk corneas, where the rejection rate can be as high as 70% occurring in the first 6 months, and the graft survival is less than 50% at 3 to 5 years. So it is important for us to stratify the 2 different classifications. Some studies have looked at the survival rate just of repeat penetrating keratoplasty, and you can see the data is not that great. At 1 year survival, 63%, but at about 4.5 years, the survival rate for a first graft can be as low as 28% and 20% for subsequent regrafts. Now, we do lots of things to try to prevent that. We can subject patients to systemic immunosuppression using systemic corticosteroids, calcineurin inhibitors such as cyclosporin A and tacrolimus, antimetabolites such as azathioprine and mycophenolate mofetil, and even monoclonal antibodies towards T-cell antigens. But even with all of that, the success rates are not all that great. If we look at all the studies that are in the literature, most of them are small, uncontrolled studies. But the results are not that much different than not doing systemic immunosuppression. Take cyclosporin A, for example. In this particular study, the graft clarity rate was 55% at 3.5 years, which is not appreciably different than that in the control group. And the range of graft clarity in other studies ranges from 32% to 77%. With tacrolimus, graft clarity rate 65% to 77% at about 1.5 to 3 years. And with mycophenolate mofetil, 26% to 87% graft survival at 3 years. So a wide range, some of the success rates not very good. On top of that, we have to consider the side effects of systemic immunosuppression. With the corticosteroids, we know the topical manifestations. With systemic, we're aware of osteoporosis and weight gain. But with other things, such as the calcineurin inhibitors, they're known to have nephrotoxicity, hepatotoxicity, hypertension, malignancies, and with mycophenolate mofetil, myelosuppression. So these are things to really keep in your mind when you're thinking about subjecting a patient to a high-risk transplant and the consequences that might come from that. So let's contrast that to the Boston keratoprosthesis. My colleagues will speak more to this in detail, but as we all know, this has been around since 1965, invented by Klaus Dolman in Boston. And over the last 45 years or so, it's really been developed into a very good product. This is the type 1, which I will focus on. The type 2 is the one that goes to the lid, but that's for a separate talk. This is the basic design. There is a front optic followed by the patient's cornea, and then the back plate, and then a titanium locking ring. K-Pro usage has gone up exponentially in the last 10 years. It used to be that most of these cases were done in Boston, and in the last 10, especially the last 5 to 6 years, there's been steady increases in the number of cases being done throughout the United States and especially internationally, such that over 3,500 have been implanted worldwide as of earlier this year. So what are the requirements of doing a keratoprosthesis implantation? We need the device. We need a chronic bandage contact lens that needs to be changed out periodically, chronic antibiotic therapy, and monitoring for glaucoma as well as various other complications which will be discussed later. What about the visual outcomes? Just in brief, this one study out of Johns Hopkins has shown that visual acuity actually comes back very quickly. 25% of patients at 1 week achieved their best corrected visual acuity, 70% at 3 months, and with very little refractive error. This is a patient of mine who had multiple graft failures. I placed a Boston keratoprosthesis, and by 1 week they're seeing their best corrected vision of 20/25 and has maintained that 3.5 years later. This is another patient, multiple graft failures, vascularized cornea. Before they developed the retroprosthetic membrane, they were seeing 20/40, and after excision of that membrane, back to 20/40, and it's been about 2.5 years. What about retention rates? People worry about extrusion of these devices or failure of these devices. From the data that we have to date, these are some of the studies in the literature of larger studies showing that the graft retention rate for these devices is anywhere from 100% at 10 months to 80% at nearly 3 years. If we try to stratify those patients out to just the high-risk transplants or prior graft failures, we see that the data is about the same in terms of all comers, limbal cell deficiency, and the prior graft failures. There certainly is a subset of complications that are not encountered with high-risk transplant, and those are specific to the device. These will definitely be discussed in more detail later, but just some of the things include retroprosthetic membrane, increased intraocular pressure, glaucoma progression, endophthalmitis, and even chronic hypotony has been recently seen. It's just an example of a patient who lost her bandage contact lens, developed some stromal melting and epithelial breakdown, developed a candidal infection that needed explantation of the graft. This is another fungal infection in a keratoprosthesis. So it's not without complications. So what are the limitations of this device to widespread use? Well, first of all, in the United States, the device costs $5,000. I've been told that in India, this device can be created without the titanium locking ring for as low as $80, and that may lower the barrier for widespread use of this. We still do need corneal tissue. It's been shown that we can use pre-cut gamma-irradiated corneal lenticules now that can be stored for a long time, and patients have actually had their own corneas excised and then retransplanted back as the carrier for this device. One of the bigger problems is the need for chronic antibiotic therapy as well as the need for the contact lens to be changed out. But Tony Aldave has recently showed us that in addition to the studies that have come out of various countries in Asia and in other international places, that in his series of patients that have been done overseas, when compared to his own patients done in Los Angeles, that the outcomes have been really very good and very comparable between the two groups in terms of visual outcomes, retention rates, and the rate of postoperative complications. Only the rate of endophthalmitis was actually higher in the international group compared to his own group. So this suggests that this is definitely a device that can have worldwide appeal. When we look at the cost utility of this device in terms of quality adjusted life years, you see that penetrating keratoplasty is about $12,000 per quali. Compare that to a Boston keratoprosthesis type 1, which is about $16,000. But keep in mind that these are done with the figures of the cost of the device being several $1,000s in the United States. So if we can lower that cost, I think that it actually will be more cost effective. So when we're faced with a patient trying to decide between doing a high-risk PK and a Boston keratoprosthesis, these are some of the things that we should think about. The graft failure rate, again, is actually higher in a shorter amount of time than the device retention rate. And so the device, as far as we know, at 3 years, about 80% of them are maintained. And with the faster visual rehabilitation, the patients actually have a longer period of useful vision. The complications, we can avoid any systemic immunosuppression from the high-risk transplants. They have, everybody has a standard risk of just doing a penetrating keratoplasty, but the immune suppression is something that we can certainly avoid. And if we take all this in consideration, the cost of the device, less survival rate, and therefore requiring more transplants, I actually think that the keratoprosthesis is and will be shown to be more cost-effective than doing a high-risk transplant. But in summary, these are things that need to be gone into the thought process, and I thank you for your attention.